So, welcome participants to this MOOC course on disaster management. I am Shahab Fazal, faculty in the Department of Geography at Aligarh Muslim University. In our previous session, I gave you some perspective on disaster, some definitions, and now you may have fair idea of the phenomena, the disaster. In this session, we would look into the concept and major types of disasters. So, disasters, now you are aware of this term, it is an unwelcome event, disastrous event. It disrupts normal life and puts the development target out of gear. Disasters can result from natural or man-made causes or a combined effect of both. The impact of disasters are felt more strongly when the affected community is less prepared, either in terms of physical exposure or vulnerable socio-economic conditions. Therefore, disaster is a public administration issue with a developmental notion. Think about it. What I want to highlight here is that these events, they also have bearing on our developmental efforts. If these developmental efforts are better in any society, in any community, then the impacts would be lesser. So you would find that most of the developing society, they are more vulnerable to these events rather than the developed world. I would say that disasters are no longer reckoned as the wrath of God, curse of God. Modern science and technology have helped us to understand the mechanisms that result in such catastrophic events, and also in devising means to minimize their ill effects, their adverse effects. In this modern era of technologies, aided with satellite and other remote sensing techniques, etc., the magnitude of damages wreaked by natural calamities can be reduced considerably by building a culture of prevention through awareness, knowledge, and appropriate use of technologies. We may not be able to eliminate the occurrences of such events, disasters, but certainly action can be taken to reduce their impact. And such actions are termed as mitigatory efforts. Disasters need to be restricted because communities and people, they suffer due to adverse situation, due to crisis situation. There are important socio-economic benefits also from disaster. The disaster reduction. It reduces the developmental gap between rich and poor. Again, think about it as to how we can explain this, how we can justify it. These objectives, in addition to any global perspective which conceives of the planet as victim, a disaster anywhere is a disaster everywhere. Because if disaster happens at any location, other locations are also suffered from it. In the way the communication linkages may be damaged, the supply of goods would be affected. So in that way, I may say that a disaster anywhere is a disaster everywhere. So disaster hold the potential for having weapons of mass destruction like effects. Weapons of mass destruction like effects around the world. A good example can be the coronavirus. Or in modern day, you can think of global economic recession. So the impact is very widespread. So disaster study leads us to the issue of sustainable development. Since study and research in the area of disaster is increasing, revealing human causatives behind disaster phenomena, therefore, disaster management is more a policy issue. Even according to the 10th plan, they have treated as a subject of calamity relief, therefore classified under non-plan expenditure. There has been a policy shift post Yokohama Conference in 19 1994. And in that, plan allocation made under respective sectors plan heads for disaster mitigation. It is widespread. These planning initiatives, they have been implemented everywhere. The reasoning is simple. If disasters are inherent, inevitable in the socio-physical circumstances, environment, their manifestation could be controlled through better management of the environment or the circumstances by reducing the potency of socio-economic and physical variables which contribute to the disaster and the resultant losses over time. Each disaster, natural or technological or human-induced, it presents a new challenge. In most cases, the events are difficult to avert but can give some precursor signals. And here, the technology, the timely information can be provided to the people, and subsequently the people, communities and societies, they can take precautions. They can respond to the situation, prepare to the situation. There exists no mechanism for preventing the event, but there are instruments, there are technologies for detecting the intensity and also the probable impacts of the phenomena, the event, disastrous event. Therefore, the primary challenge of the loss-inflicting event is to identify the types and how this can impact communities and the consequences incurred thereafter. So, proper planning and emergency preparedness is required by the local, state, central policymakers and governments, which includes hazard identification and risk assessments to address these adverse situations. Globally, in most countries, there is poor or unplanned development, which leads to inequality. There is weak governance, and there are widespread environmental degradation. These are some factors for disaster prevalence. These compromise the growth and economic development, social welfare and environmental health. So in that context, I would say, when we talk about the emerging challenges, we can relate it with the developmental initiatives. Because whenever adverse crisis situation, disastrous events, they take place which result into some kind of losses to the human life and human life system, they actually impacts the economic growth, development, social welfare, etc. So, I will provide you another dimension. I would say that the disasters are not always negative, since the negatives could open up positive avenues, opportunities for development and growth, as portrayed in this slide. Disaster, as we have understood by now, they causes losses, they causes damages, destruction, trauma, all kinds of losses of livelihood. It may also lead to environmental degradation. But on positive side, it offers opportunity with development, innovation, transformations, improvements, help us to achieve self-sufficiency. It might also lead to have better sharing, supportive among the communities. These are all positive notions which may be the outcome of disaster. Because crisis situation, the human response, if it is effective, proactive, it creates an opportunity for development. So disaster in a community or society is the outcome of societal implications rather than only the events, whether it is natural or man-made. disastrous events. This conceptual idea that anthropogenic elements play a major role in manifestation of disasters led to the development of the theoretical background based on which the paradigm shift in disaster management has evolved. So, disaster can be understood as some rapid or instantaneous event born out of natural or man-made environment having extremely adverse impact on life of the human being. That is beyond the coping capacity of the people. The views of Charles Fritz takes disaster as concentrated in time and space in which a society or a community undergoes severe danger and incurs such losses to its member and physical apparatuses that the social structure is disrupted or some of the essential functions of the society is prevented or restricted. Likewise, Fred Pampel takes that a disaster is an unusual and dramatic event that in a relatively short time span causes enough destruction to disrupt the normal pattern of living in any specific geographic space. A closer look at different meanings and definitions of disaster lead us to decipher the nature of a disaster. In discerning certain fundamental features that are considered essential in characterization of a disaster, though the relative weightage accorded to each of these features may vary in conceptualization of disaster by different experts, they nevertheless are taken to be mandatory elements for an event to be called as disaster. So, at the very outset, a disaster is in the nature of an event that may be product of a process. In other words, despite the elements of hazard, vulnerability, risk and capacity action in tandem with each other to produce a disaster, disaster per se is understood only in the form of an event such as earthquake, cyclone or fire. However, in contemporary times, all kinds of untoward events, whether caused by natural or man-made factors, disasters can be said are the consequences of inappropriately managed risk. The structures, functions and activities of humans are also seen as the cause of disasters. However, disasters have many facets. While their mechanism requires the study of scientific aspects of their genesis and life cycle, their impacts on the environment or the impacts on the society, and it requires multidisciplinary approach involving social, economic, developmental and technological approaches. Here are many prevalent approaches for disaster studies. If I can highlight some of them, I will go to the traditional deterministic approach, which puts nature as an active dominating force, while human beings, they are considered as passive force. So, in the deterministic approach, disasters are said to be the curse of God. It is the natural reason for the occurrence, ill effect on the human being. That is what the deterministic approach is all about. But modern day technocentric approach, where the disasters, we can say, are thought of inevitable. It may happen. All the time there is probability of its occurrence. But the solutions for which lay in protecting from extreme events. So, a lot of focus is on technological know-how, where engineering and management studies were considered as remedial measures. Like for earthquake disaster, building resistant structures are very important and critical. In this technology driven approach, technocentric approach, for floods, the remote sensing monitoring of the flood situation, for locating the embankments, the breach in the embankments, For diseases, the vaccination and medication, these are technological response. And in the technocentric approach, the focus is more on the technology so that we can overcome, we can manage these disastrous events. In modern day, there is another important approach which is called as human-centric approach, where the human factor has been brought into the forefront, which in deterministic and many other approach were sidelined, or I may also say neglected. This entire concept of disaster, it revolves around human being. So we cannot neglect the human presence, human impact or the human losses. So the attempt consequently is to inquire into sociological processes, the ability and capacity of the people, which determines or undermine a community's resilience, coping capacity and response to disasters. A more modern approach can be said as ecology-centric approach, where disaster is considered as a total event involving interaction between environment and nature and the organized human action, the human response. As society interacts with the environment, with its values, its perception, its culture, and engages in a series of processes over which it has varied control and knowledge. Because different society have different culture, different perception, values and technological improvements, development. So it has varied control and knowledge about the system. For example, development and planning processes, production and distribution of goods over a long period of time, underlying hazard turned into disaster. Now, more common academic disciplines also contribute a lot to the different approaches to the disaster studies. The first I will take as geographical approach, which is space-oriented approach. Here, social science methods are widely used and emphasized, which is given to the spatio-temporal distribution of hazard, impacts and vulnerability. For example, spatial information application for hazard mapping and risk assessment, or even resource allocation or rescue planning with the use of geospatial techniques. In this geographical approach, geographic space is at the core of all the activities related with disaster and its management. Another could be the anthropological approach. This approach focuses on the role of disaster in guiding the socio-economic evolution of the people, the population, in dispersing them and in causing the destruction of the community, civilization. This includes mapping and vulnerabilities, understanding local coping strategies, addressing the social impacts of disasters, where the human abilities, they are considered to be important in the consequences and coping of the disastrous event. A related approach could be the sociological approach to disaster studies, which emphasizes understanding the social dimensions of disaster and how societal structures, inequalities, and collective behaviors influence the disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. So, this sociological approach also focuses the human societal response, characteristic, features of the community. Another approach, if I can highlight, that may be termed as epidemiology approach. which focuses on management of casualties, the treatment of severe physical trauma, if I can give this example, the epidemiological surveillance of communicable diseases, whose incidence rates may increase during the disruption of public health measures following a disaster. It also involves assessing both short and long-term health effects to guide emergency responses, the recovery efforts, and also future disaster preparedness. So in this epidemiological approach, more focus is on the losses, the casualties, and with the technology, with the improved abilities of the human being, how to overcome it, that kind of approach would be called as epidemiological approach. Then I would also like to highlight that how with time there is paradigm shift in the disaster studies. Now, paradigm shift is the change in the way of thinking. So, in the context of disaster management, understanding disaster, you would have observed that how with time to understand, we have changed the way we understand the disaster from thinking of disasters are the outcome of curse of God. Now we think about how it can be linked to developmental efforts. So in that context, I am saying that there is paradigm shift, and this paradigm shift is the change in which in the way we think about disaster. The transformation in thinking is fueled by agents of changes and occurs through a process of evolution. As I have said, historically, disaster management has been a reactive process. Once the incident is over, we respond to it. That is what historically disaster management was being approached. It was reactive process. As disaster research evolved, it was observed that it often not possible to stop hazardous occurrences. They are inevitable. But preventive measure can be taken to minimize the adverse impacts of the hazards. The term disaster risk reduction is used to mention such measures. So the paradigm shift in fact focuses on implementing these risk reduction measures. It is a shift in approach from reactive approach, where actions are taken after the disaster occurrence, for example, providing humanitarian assistance, relief work, etc., to proactive approach, where holistic, integrated planning and management of disaster is envisioned. For example, building seismically protected structures, creating legislations, different kind of frameworks, guidelines for disaster management, setting up of emergency operating centers and response force like NDMA in our country, generating a culture of prevention, capacity building, etc. And this MOOC course is also part of it, where we want to sensitize the students, the general masses, to understand that disasters are no longer the curse of God. In fact, we are highlighting that it is more proactive, developmental initiatives. In other words, it aims at addressing the root cause of prospective disasters, ill effects, rather than addressing the stress and shocks, adverse situations arising after the disaster. So disaster needs to be restricted so that the communities and people, they do not suffer. However, disasters are also preventable in some sense. If the appropriate measures are in place and working. All the time, disasters are the events which result into losses. But appropriate measures, if they are in place and they are functional, but this technological fix presupposes a vertical approach to the problem. Here, a horizontal approach tries to address the root, broad causes of a problem, while a vertical approach tries to zero in on specific manifestation of a problem. In disaster security, as opposed to health security, one is more likely to find vertical approaches taken, as evident by the existence of specialized agencies and organizations which zero in on just one type of disaster, like Tsunami Institute or any research lab for epidemic disasters. Think about it. What is your opinion? How the disaster needs to be tackled? What should be our approach? Horizontal to address the cause or vertical to fix the problem? Think about it. Discuss it. I close this session. Happy learning.